And now for this evening's program that I have eagerly anticipated for over a year. Dr. Karen Gray was born in Big Valley, Alberta, Canada, and grew up in Spokane, Washington. She earned a Bachelor of Arts degree from Whitworth University in Spokane, followed by a 3-year postgraduate degree from Harvard Divinity School, and was then awarded a PhD under the Faculty of Theology at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Dr. Gray resided in Washington, D.C. for 30 years, and for 20 of those, she was employed by the Smithsonian Institution's Associate Program, developing educational tours in the Mid-Atlantic region on subjects ranging from art to zoology. In 2001, she moved to Hagerstown, where she volunteers for the C&O Canal National Historic Park as an expert on the canal's history and engineering. She also teaches non-credit classes in history, literature, religion, and philosophy for Hagerstown and Frederick Community Colleges. Speaking on the topic of the C&O Canal, surprising truths and colorful myths, I am pleased to introduce Dr. Karen Gray.
Thank you very, very much. I'm going to share the screen and pull up my PowerPoint. And just confirm you all are seeing the screen.
I see it.
Oh, great. We're in great shape. Yeah, well, we can start with the picture. This is an early example of Photoshop activity. They changed the steam that was rising straight up and put it along the back of the train so it would look like it was racing along the tracks against the pokey old canal boat down beside it. In reality, it was standing still. So one of the things I always like to emphasize to people is that all sources are fallible. Don't ever take any source as definitely true. You'll get into trouble again and again in your life. And that includes the one speaking to you right now. Okay, that's me. So I'm going to tell you the story of 6 eras of the canal. The first was 1785 to 28, the Potomac Company era. Actually, mostly not canal. We'll talk about that. 3 canal boating eras, 1828 to 50, construction. And after 1831, as the canal begins to open in section, used by riverboats that were called gondolas, sharpers, floats, etc. Then 1850 to 1889, the most successful and busiest era of the canal. And then after mid-1889, the terrible flood, 1890 to 1923, a trusteeship when the canal period, when the canal was in use, navigation was occurring. And then 1924 to 38, a continuation of the trusteeship without navigation on the canal, no boats. And then 1939 to today, the National Park Service era. So first I'm going to talk about a myth, and then I'll tell you why it's not true. So we'll start with Potomac Company myth. George Washington dreamed of a canal up the Potomac Valley. The Potomac Company, also spelled in various ways, was George Washington's achievement. And the Potomac Company operated a canal. Well, Bob Capps knows I am very unhappy with the title that was given his wonderful book. But usually authors of major books that publishers publish knowing they'll make enough money to more than pay for it, require that they be allowed to name the canal. And I think that's why that happened. There was no Potomac Canal, singular. The Potomac Company's system was a river navigation system with 2 bypass canals at falls. Otherwise, with sluices along the side of the river to get past rapids and improved channels for boats in the river. They sometimes blasted rocks or moved them out of the way. Maryland's Thomas Johnson, who will become a governor, and Virginia's John Ballantyne, interesting, colorful character, were the first to push for improving the upper Potomac for navigation. Good old GW was only one of the early promoters and investors, but was the first president of the company in 1785 until 1789, when he became the first president of the United States. The two bypass canals were, of course, at Great Falls, around Great Falls, and around Little Falls. So let's look at the construction estimate myth for the C&O Canal. The estimate for completion in 10 years of the first section of the C&O Canal to Cumberland is said to have been too optimistic. The estimate for the cost of $4.5 million is also said to be too optimistic. Actually, the time for construction and the cost were determined by the Geddes-Roberts 1826 survey using their experience with costs and construction time on the first Erie. Very experienced. You can't get better engineers than that in 1826. No one anticipated the effects of labor shortages, the inflated cost of land that occurred, the national financial instability during those years and a couple major crises, and the difficulties of the final route and the structures that it required. In reality, during the years from 1842 to 46, little or no construction took place, and irregular work was done between 46 to 50. So 1829 to 41 and 46 to 50, about 15 years of construction, and not really full 20 or plus. Unruh, a very important National Park Service historian in the mid-1970s, states that after adjustment for unpredictable and unavoidable increases, the cost overrun was, as you see, over $2 million, or about 18.9%. And that's a statistic that could actually easily be justified by the rising inflation of the period. So actually, the Geddes and Roberts estimate was not far off. The tunnel was begun in 1836 and it was hauled through in 1839. It's usually blamed for the long delay, and that is an untruth. Many of the structures along the last 50 miles, not just the tunnel, were only partially built when construction ended in the spring of 1842. The final contracting era, 1846 to 50, was subject to contract failures and intermittent work on many of those unfinished structures on the upper 50 miles. That is a very messy era to try to study in terms of construction. So some myths and misunderstandings. The C&O is a continuous canal up the Potomac that is 184.5 miles long. We'll see why that's not true. The canal operated from 1850 to 1924. That's not true. The oral histories give us a good view of the canal operation and canalers' lives, and that is not true. Well, this is why the canal is not a continuous canal, because the first section that was built from DC up to Dam 4, the boats then have a half a mile of little slackwater river navigation where there is no canal. And then there is a middle section of the canal that goes from above Little Slackwater up to dam number 5. And at dam number 5 again, Big Slackwater is 3¼ miles. Dam number 5 again, you've got about half a mile of slackwater navigation where there is no canal. So we actually have 3 canals with 2 river navigation sections. That's actually kind of the reverse of what the Potomac Company had, because it had 2 canals and otherwise it was all river navigation. So keep in mind that any water you see down in the middle or lower section of the canal is not coming from Cumberland. So opening the lower canal, 1831 to 32, it opened from dam number 2 inlet at mile 22.12. But lock 23, which you see there right beside the inlet from behind dam number 2, bringing water in from behind the dam, was not watered because that water will have to come from above it. So it won't get water in it and be operable until the next part of the canal is opened. I'll get to that in a minute. Now, Seneca in the early 19th century meant the Seneca Falls area, which is just below the dam number 2, not the later community up at the mouth of Seneca Creek and Lock 24, about 3/4 of a mile up. When I began to research this area, I kept getting confused by their referring to Seneca, which did not seem to be correct. And I finally figured out that their Seneca was the head of the falls. And that makes sense because that's when the boats coming down the river, those shallow, narrow, long boats, would have had to have gone to land, or later under the Potomac Company had a sluice available to get past those falls. So those falls at the head of the falls, that was the important point. In 1833, the canal opened from Inlet Lock 3 behind the US Armory Dam. That dam the Canal Company never owned and did not have to build. They drew from the pool behind the Armory Canal, about 1.5 miles above Harper's Ferry. And so once they could open up from there and all the structures below that were open, then they could water all the way down to Violet's Lock and join the watered canal at 22 miles above Washington. So it waters now a pretty good section of the canal. And you see in this picture, back behind it, the inlet channel where it flows into the main canal with the towpath bridge over it. Lock 35, you can't see very well, but you can see the little lock house shanty beside it. And the main stem of the canal is up there on that nice little ledge that you can see. Now, this picture drives me crazy because it raises the question, why is a canal freight boat in the inlet lock? And incidentally, big boats like that did not appear on the canal until it gets to Cumberland. So it also could not go through those inlet locks. They were not as big as the locks on the main stem of the canal. None of the inlet locks nor the river locks were built for the big freight boats. I think, my theory is that they actually would load and unload cargo here, and then boats that could manage to get across the river to the Armory Canal, to the head of the Armory Canal, could transfer cargo here. And for many reasons, that might work better if you were sending stuff to Harper's Ferry than to try to use the river lock at Harper's Ferry, which I won't get into right now. So they finished the lower canal in 1835 and opened from Dam 4. Remember, above Dam 4, we have big slack water, 3¼ miles, to Inlet Lock 35 above Dam 3, Armory Dam Inlet. That means the entire lower canal from Inlet 4 to Rock Creek was now watered. So up there at Dam 4, the inlet lock is actually 1 mile and almost 1/4 upstream of the dam with a high guard wall all the way along. And that's critical because inlet locks have to be at river level. And if the Potomac just maintained a nice even level, that would be lovely. But the Potomac is one of the great fickle rivers of the world. And it can't be decide whether above tide water, what we call the upper Potomac, to be so shallow you can walk across many places, or to just flood everybody out within half a mile of the river. So the guard wall is critical to any of our locks that make contact with the river, the tide lock, the river locks, the lower end of the river locks, and the inlet locks, or guard locks, as they're often called, because they go through a guard wall. So if you were coming in from the river, this is what it would look like as you approach the first lock of that lower section. And the mules are going to have to change the side of the boat they're on because they're going to be along the river as they continue up the canal. This assumes you're coming downstream. Look how high those gates are. That's how high the guard wall was. So the upstream gates had to be really high. So again, now we've finished the lower section. We've got to big slack water, 3¼ miles, and we're going to go into the middle section. The middle canal in 1835 opened from Dam 5 Inlet at lock 106.8 down to lock 41 at the upper end of big slack water. So we have that nice middle section completed. Just a few months, about 3/4 of a year, but a different calendar year after the lower canal was completed. The first boat that we're told was built for canal navigation, not river navigation, began service at this time, but unfortunately, they didn't tell us much about that boat. So we don't know how big it was, what it looked like, et cetera, et cetera. And there will be no towpath through big slack water back there until 1839. So boats had to navigate that 3¼ miles without tow animals along the side of the river to pull the boat while it was in river. And that to me is a big puzzle. How did the boats, any boat that was built for the canal, manage along that level? Now, the river boats were okay because they were designed and built and they had crew who knew how to manage the handling the boat in the river. But any boat built just for the canal would be in trouble. The lower part of the upper canal opened in 1839 from Dam 6 at mile 134.10 above Hancock down to lock 45 at the upper end of Little Slackwater. So now we have in 1839, we have for 10 years, Dam number 6 will be the upper limit of the canal, 134.10 miles, because the rest of it won't open until 1850. And then the canal opens from Dam 8 at Cumberland to the inlet from Dam 6, just below Lock 54, completing the upper canal. And of course, it was supposed to go to the Ohio, but it will end at Cumberland forever. So just a little quick overview of what happens. 31 down there, mile 22, we opened Dam 2. 33, we opened from Dam 3. 35 from Dam 5. 39 from Dam 6. And then Dam 8, 1850. Dam 7 is missing. Did you notice? It won't get built. And they didn't build Dam 3. They got to use the government dam. So let's talk a little bit about the riverboat era. 1831 to how long did riverboats come into the canal? We don't know that, but they continued to come in for some time after the canal reached Cumberland. They served farms and mills and businesses along the Potomac and its tributaries. Even some of the minor streams like Back Creek actually had boats navigating on it. Every time I go by there on the train, I think, how could they? But they did. How were they moved when in the canal? They weren't permitted to use poles. That would have damaged the clay lining. But then those boats could be pulled by human beings. Once you get a boat moving on water, it's actually pretty easy. So the riverboat era, 31 to 50 boats built to navigate the upper Potomac and tributaries, entering by way of inlet and river locks, sections of the canal open. As sections open. With the development of boatyards in Cumberland in the 1850s, we have the era dominated by what becomes the standard C&O Canal freight boat. Nice picture of one here. Look how low it's riding in the water. That means it's headed downstream with coal in it, probably 99 times out of 100. Almost all our canal boat images, photographs, are from the 1890 to 23 trusteeship era, and that's unfortunate. I'd give anything to have pictures from that earlier period. So some boating myths. The boats weighed up to 150 tons. The standard hull was 92 to 95 feet long. Families owned, lived on, and ran the boat. All untrue. The full-size canal boat weighed about 20 to 22 tons. It could carry a maximum of 130 tons, but it usually carried 110 to 120. A fully loaded boat weighed up to around 150 tons, including, of course, its cargo. Now we have the biggest problem in C&O Canal history, a major problem with the length of the boats. Canal company records include boats 92 feet long, they tell us, and the National Park Service measured the hull of a derelict boat as 93.5 feet long. Well, here's the problem. Look at these locks. These locks are all within a little bit of 90 feet length. So, when I studied this era before 1889, especially, what I find is all male crews. And this picture is one of our rare earlier pictures. This was when the Consolidation Coal Company owned a big fleet of boats, you see there. And look, we have a 5-man crew. So this boat may very well have operated 24 hours a day and not had sleep at night. The children are doubtless the lock tenders, and the 3 nicely dressed people are, you can believe it, not crew. Okay, so this is probably pretty typical of that 1850 to 1889 period. Okay, we have a wonderful document, and it's available on the internet. 1859, before the Civil War, trip down the canal. The boat had 5 crew. Captain Koss, the inexperienced author of this, who was hired in Cumberland, a man named Henry Pick Butler, a free colored man, and 2 tow boys, about 12, one little Pick and Tommy hired on a previous trip. And that's actually a pretty typical crew for that 1850 to 1889 period. So let's talk about railroads a minute. The B&O superiority is seen in its arrival at Cumberland 8 years before the C&O. The canal was obsolete by the time it opened the last 50 miles. The railroads were always successful and great transportation systems. I actually have just posted on my new Facebook page some of the evidence against these particular myths. And for those who didn't log on, the Facebook page is C&O Canal History and Technology. It's a group, you'll have to join it. The first station out of Baltimore was called Relay because that is where they changed the horses. The B&O initially used stationary steam engines to pull the trains up over Purse Spring Ridge west of Baltimore, because those early engines had very little power. The B&O didn't know how it was going to get to the Ohio in the 1830s and 40s. It was still working on the problem when it got to Cumberland, and won't get out of Cumberland till late in the 1840s. Also, oddly, the C&O was using these three-pot coal hoppers. I can track them using it right up to 1870, holding about 10 tons each. Thus, one train could pull about 13 of those, 130 tons, while two mules could pull one C&O Canal freighter holding up to 130 tons. Water transportation is always better. Not until the end of the 19th century will the railroads have the technology and infrastructure for efficiently hauling large quantities of heavy freight. They're going to need bigger and better freight cars, right? But then you're going to need a lot more powerful engines. But then you're going to need steel rails, realignments, and infrastructure improvements. And you're going to need reliable air brakes and knuckle couplers. And those things are coming down the pike, but they take a while. Today, inland waterways remain relevant as their cargo. 14% of all intercity freight is carried in this country on inland waterways. They include some 12,000 miles of navigable channels with 240 lock sites. A standard barge on them can carry as much cargo as 16 rail cars or 70 trucks. And barges can move 1 ton of coal 576 miles for the same amount of fuel as it takes a rail car to go 413 miles and a truck 155. And this is on the Mississippi, incidentally, wonderful big locks with large pools behind them. Almost all the 19th century canals failed to change with the usage requirement, the Erie being an exception. There are 3 versions of the Erie, the last being the New York Barge Canal. So captains owned the boat and charged to carry cargo is a myth, or they worked for the owner, and that was common. With the money they earned, captains hired the crew they needed. A minimum properly crewed boat included someone at the tiller, someone with the mules, and someone caring for mules coming off or going on the towpath and doing all the other chores. Now, if you had a 3-person crew, you stopped and rested at night, or maybe several times, day and night. Captains working for coal companies sometimes leave Cumberland with more than 1 boat in their care. We think they were towing or convoying with such crew on each boat as was necessary. And they are sent down the canal with different boats sometimes, not always taking the same boat, likely whatever boat was ready to go after they got back up from their previous run. There's considerable evidence that most crews were all male, not nuclear families for whom the boat was a home. That won't happen till much later. Some of the crew may have been related. That's not uncommon, a brother, a son, older son especially, etc. And sometimes a wife who was cook and helped take care of the mules. 24-hour boats usually had 1 or more additional animals in crew. 24-hour boats could make a round trip in 7 days if unloaded promptly and loaded promptly at the other end. Now, during the 1870s and into the 80s, we actually had quite a number of steamships. And I got so excited when I found this picture of 2 in the river at Cumberland. They would have gone out through the inlet lock beside Lock 8 in Cumberland. Between 540 and 600 boats were running in that important 1870s period, when the canal company was actually making pretty good money, around 18 steamboats. And The crew cabin is in the front instead of at the back by the tiller, and there's no mule barn. You don't need a mule if you got a steamboat. So let's talk about that bankruptcy period. The myth is that the B&O owned the canal after 1889. Read it all the time. Even the park is still repeating it, even though it's provable, documentable by superior sources that it's untrue. The canal was kept operating to protect it from competing railroads or to prevent the B&O Potomac Valley monopoly or for political reasons is also not true. The bankruptcy court appointed receivers to gather information, but not to sell the canal, as the court decided instead to give control of the C&O Canal to the trustees for the 1844 bondholders, bonds issued by the canal to help them finish it after they were subrogated to the 1878 bonds, right, and mortgage. So what happened was the 1844 trustees and the 1878 trustees, those issued for a major repair after the 1877 flood, got together and they said, let's lump all of our mortgages together and we'll be much more powerful and we'll have a lot more money. And they were allowed by the court to do this and to repair and operate the canal on a trial basis with court oversight. So 1844 construction bonds had mortgaged the tolls and revenue of the canal, and the B&O owned the majority of those 1878 repair bonds that mortgaged the real property of the canal. Now, there was no reason for the B&O to want to have subrogation occur. That didn't benefit it. It could do fine without 1844. And it looked like the court was going to tell the 1844 bondholders, you're just out of luck, sorry guys. But really the mortgage that counts is the one for the real property of the canal. But the B&O could see that the judges were not thinking in that direction. And the actual legal reasons that 1844 was in a strong position, despite having a weaker mortgage, I won't go into. I actually am going to do a bit of a presentation at the World Canals Conference on that. Very complex. The trustees legally represented the interests of all the bondholders. And the court ruled that the company and bondholders were best served by an operating canal. In 1896, the B&O Railroad went into receivership from which it would emerge in 1899. In the early 1900s, the Pennsylvania Railroad had effective control of the B&O through its large stock holdings and its members on the B&O Railroad Board. The reality is that the railroad history is one of frequent financial instability and multiple difficulties and failures. At the beginning of 1903, the Canal Towage Company was formed as a subsidiary of the Consolidation Coal Company to acquire and operate all the coal boats on the canal. And at that time, there were basically three owners, the major one being the Consolidation Coal Company, who owned the coal boats. At the beginning of 1918, the Canal Towage Company announced that it would cease operating, leading the U.S. Railroad Administration to cover its deficit to keep it operating during World War I, when it was essential to bring coal to Washington. The justification for the USRA to do that was, in order to avoid the loss of this means of transportation of coal to Washington and vicinity, they went as far as the Navy Depot 30 miles down the river, pulled by tugs, during the acute congestion which then existed on the railroads and the shortage of coal, which then appeared imminent if war conditions continued. So here's actually a U.S. Railroad Administration coal boat. They had 10 built to carry coal to Coal Depot at wharves in the Federal District and at Indian Head. So the C&O Canal boats served wharves in Georgetown and Alexandria and on the Potomac and the Anacostia rivers, including the Navy Yard, and even 30 miles down the river. The wharves were part of that original water-based transportation system in the tidewater areas that the railroads did not serve or minimally served. The railroads will largely replace the system as the 20th century progresses. So the canal went out of business in 1924 as a myth. The B&O Railroad sold the canal to the government as a myth. The B&O was paid $2 million by the government for the canal as a myth. The last boating year on the canal was 1923. The flood in late March of 24 prevented the opening of the canal in the spring. Another flood in May led the trustees to seek court permission not to repair the canal for reopening as business did not warrant it. This was permitted on a temporary basis with the canal to be reopened if needed. Thus, 1923 was the last year of navigation and the canal was never reopened. The Georgetown level was watered to sell water to the industries in Georgetown. A skeleton staff was maintained along the canal, and the company continued to earn income through leases and rents, all of which was required by the court. In 1938, with the government interested in the canal and trustees wishing to sell it, the court appointed receivers who had the canal condemned and sold for, they finally ultimately got $2,100,000. $2 million was paid by the federal government. $100,000 was paid by the B&O for strips of land in Georgetown and along the Narrows above the Point of Rocks. Of the $2.1 million, the B&O received $1,880,000 some to pay outstanding debts and as partial payment of the canal. The legal challenges and appeals to this settlement will not end until 1945. So let's get finally to the myths about making the park. That the Justice Douglas Washington Post hike in March of '54 saved the canal from becoming a parkway. And Eisenhower's National Monument proclaimed further protected the canal from proclamation, further protected the canal from the various threats. Well, in January of 1953, Erskine R. Barnes, president of the Audubon Society of DC and Washington Post nature writer, advocated restoration of the whole canal in a January 1953 article. He wrote, "Let the canal be restored as a highway for canoes, perhaps for a few old barges. Let the towpath become a country lane for hikers and cyclists. Provide an abundance of small campsites. Prepare the lock houses as hostels for winter use." In the spring of 1953, Anthony Wayne, Tony Smith, a tough old CIO attorney active in the National Parks Association, sent the National Park Service a Potomac Valley Recreation Project proposal akin to Barnes' proposal. Smith followed it up with a phone call to NPS Associate Superintendent Terry Thompson, in which he strongly, I would love to have listened in, expressed the position of those opposed to the Parkway proposal. So in 1953, May 7th, the DC Audubon Society calls a meeting of diverse groups interested to organize opposition to the Parkway. Meeting at the home of Mrs. Gifford Pinchot, I hope that name means something to you, with 50 people. Present were Erskine Barnes, Shirley Briggs, Constance Southworth of the Society, Howard Zonheiser, Executive Secretary of the Wilderness Society, and of course, Anthony Wayne Smith and 45 others. On January 3rd, 1954, when the Washington Post editorial came out in favor of the parkway, the opposition was already organized and active. Douglas's letter inviting the editors to hike the towpath with him and the hike itself culminated in participants talking compromise, namely, save as much of the canal as possible. It really made people aware of all the diverse claims on that route up the Potomac. The Washington Post similarly qualified, it did not reverse it, qualified their position in a similar way, save as much as possible. Not until 56 did canal lovers agree that they should seek to have a whole canal made a National Historic Park. Efforts to get the C&O Canal National Historical Park legislation passed were made and failed in the 85th Congress, 86th Congress, 87th Congress. Note, the 22 miles of the canal below Inlet 2 have been restored by the CCC between 1938 and 41, and it was designated the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal Recreational Waterway and was fully managed under the NPS. On January 18th, 1961, 2 days before he left office, President Eisenhower, using the 1906 Antiquities Act, a completely wrong use of it, proclaimed 162 miles of the C&O Canal lands above Inlet 2 a national monument. However, Eisenhower failed to consult Wayne Aspinall, Democrat from Colorado, chair of the House Interior and Insular Affairs Committee, as was required by congressional courtesy. Aspinall, no friend of the National Park Service, subsequently blocked committee action on the C&O Canal. Also, Ike's proclamation contained the provision that nothing in it was intended to prejudice the canal's land and use for such works as the Congress may hereafter authorize for municipal and domestic water supply, navigation, flood control, drainage, recreation, or other beneficial purposes. It was totally toothless. Suddenly, in the summer of 1970, with the proposal of the Potomac National River proposal collapsing, opposition to the canal park virtually disappeared. Now, Aspinall even agreed to hold hearings, and there is speculation that Aspinall had mellowed because of a recent romance and marriage. I like to say we may have gotten our National Historical Park because of love. In the hearing, Senator Mac Mathias testified that action was urgent due to rising land values. And he said, "This is the last blow of the trumpet as far as the C&O Canal is concerned." And demonstrating the connection being made between canal lands and concern for the Potomac's pollution levels, he also stated, "The key to the salvation of the Potomac River is to pass this bill and to establish this park." Why? As the vertebrae upon which the state and local and private effort can build so that we can preserve the river. Note why he wanted the bill to pass. October 5th, 1970, the bill to create the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal National Park was passed by the House unamended. December 22, the bill passed the Senate, and January 8, 1971, signed into law by President Nixon vacationing at San Clemente, California. Saving the canal was about recreation, ranging from Douglas's wild hiking, biking, to Barnes's recreational waterway for canoes and campgrounds and lockhouses. For nature, the National Maryland departments concerned with river usage, natural resources. It was about fishing, hunting, natural habitats, and river access. And Potomac water quality for legislators and others, a growing concern. But what of the canal itself? During all those years, there is no voice for the structures and the history. No, the B&O did not make the canal obsolete. They go into all the wharfs all over those waterways at Tidewater. The 19th century crews were likely often not families, but rather boatmen and some young towboys. Not till really the 1920s, 1910s and 20s did you get families under the Canal Towage Company. So what we get is many changes during the history of the canal, one continual one. History is not in the past. History is our present information and understanding of the past. Change the information and you change the history. So.
Thank you, Dr. Gray. And before we begin with questions and your answers, if you could please repeat the name of your newly founded Facebook group for everyone.
Yes, it's called the C&O History and C&O Canal History and Technology. And you have to request joining, but if we'll take a little while after we see your request to verify that you're a real person, and then you'll be admitted.
So C&O Canal, History and Technology.
Yes.
And you would search for that on Facebook and your group will come up.
Will come up. And it's only about 2 days old. And I think we have 18, close to 20 members. And there are lots of C&O Canal Facebook pages, but most of them are about recreation or biking or photography or a narrow area, like there's a wonderful C&O Canal families group, but there is no general history Facebook page, group. And I felt the need of one for a long time, and a techie friend said, I'll make it for you, Karen. So he did.
That's wonderful. And before we begin with questions, could you also give a plug for the 50-year conference that is being held?
Yes, the end of August, early September, with tours and papers presented here in Hagerstown. The meetings during the day will be held at the Maryland Theater. And you can find it under World Canals Conference 2021.
Very good. Thank you very much. And I will ask the first question, and then we will allow the rest of the audience to take over. In biking the canal over many years, I'm always fascinated by the fact that there seem to be communities that developed along the canal. And in particular, one that fascinates me, because I believe there was a school there, was the Four Locks community. Were those people directly employed by the canal, or they chose to try to, in the purest form of capitalism, take advantage of needs of the canal?
Both. People could lease land along the canal to have a store or a dry dock or a business of various kinds. The only kind of business you were not permitted to have on canal lands was one that sold alcohol, okay? But otherwise, yeah, almost anything went. And yeah, Four Locks was one of the major communities, but this is why when people ask me a question, I have to say, well, what time period are you talking about? Four Locks was actually largely a development later in the history of canals, late 19th century and early 20th century. And under the Canal Towage Company, which operated from 1903 to 23, Four Locks was their major depot. They owned all the boats, They owned the mules. If you were a captain hired by them and had your own mules, they'd pay you $3 per mule per trip. So you'd get a little kickback if you used your own mules. But they had their own mules, and they provided there the feed for the mules, harnesses, tow ropes, and all that. So the captain still had to hire their crew. And the Canal Towage Company paid very little because they were covering most of the costs, the boat, the maintenance of it, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what drove the captains under the Canal Towage Company to use their wives and children. And that's when you get the family operated boat. And those are poor, poor people.
There's a couple questions in the chat. The first one is, they would like you to talk a little about the furnaces along the canal.
The furnaces.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. There are actually a number of furnaces in the area, but I think what you see directly along the canal is the lime kilns. For example, up above Harper's Ferry, there's a lime kiln. Trying to think if there's, and of course there's the cement plant up above Hancock. But most of the furnaces, like the one at Antietam, are a little ways off the canal. I can't think of an iron furnace along it. There's a very interesting iron mine just up in the valley above where Dam 3 and locks 35 and 36 are. Very, very old, very deep. It's like a little canyon, but it's actually an iron mine. And we think that the Antietam iron furnace got some of its iron early on from there. Does that answer your question?
I hope so. I hope that, I think that was a good answer. The other question is, they had heard that the Boatler cement mill provided much of the cement hydraulic for the canal cement mill at Shepherdstown Battlefield. I guess they're wondering if that's correct.
I didn't understand what you were asking.
They
For
had
some reason, I'm not seeing the questions in chat.
You're not?
No, I'm not. Don't know why. Maybe because I was wiped out for a while there.
Maybe.
So what is the subject of the question?
The Boatler cement mill, did it provide much of the cement for the canal?
Oh, yes. And I've done a program for you on the cement mill. It was actually, it's very, very interesting that I always mispronounce his name. You're going to have to correct me. Is it Boteler or Boteler?
I'm not, I think it's Boatler, but.
Boteler. Okay. He actually wrote to Charles Fenton Mercer in January, before the company was even organized, the C&O Canal Company, and said, you know, I think I have the kind of limestone on my land. And of course, he had that grist mill down there, the kind of limestone on my land that makes hydraulic cement. Now, hydraulic cement, unlike lime mortar, will not wash away when exposed to water. So if they hadn't found it along the Potomac, they would have to have shipped it from upstate New York or all the way from Britain. And so that was very exciting. And yes, that was our first really good source of the kind of limestone that makes a good quality hydraulic cement. And it continued to be important until they began to develop further up. And then you get the cement mill up above Hancock and a couple others above it, and then some eventually in the Cumberland area.
Okay. We have another one. This person's interested in the construction of the canal particularly the human toll. Um,
Oh,
here in,
wow.
yeah, here in Shepherdstown, there's a cemetery with unmarked graves of Irish canal workers who died of cholera. Do you have an insight on any of this?
Yeah, and I am so grateful to Teresa and her husband for introducing me to that burial site. We have mass graves here and there along the canal. Most of those deaths were due to the various summer waterborne diseases. And after 1832, in 1832, Asiatic cholera reaches North America. And it works its way up the Potomac, actually from the New York, Philadelphia, west onto the C&O Canal. And it is deadly. It doesn't kill everybody, but it kills a very high percentage of those who get it. And probably was the major cause for our mass graves. And there's a very interesting, and you can find an hour-long program, a couple hour-long programs about it on YouTube. The case that took place along the railroads west of Philadelphia called Duffy's Cut. And there's a book based on the story, The Ghosts of Duffy's Cut, a whole group of Irishmen who disappeared. And ultimately, we have reason to believe, because later, after the book was written, they finally did some archaeological dig, found remains, did forensics on them, and determined that some of those people were murdered, did not die of the disease, probably to keep them from going out into the community and carrying the disease to the community, and also from making the community turn against the contractor and his workers. When I was shown the place where likely there is a mass grave there in Shepherdstown, Duffy's Cut came to mind, because they report is that they were carried, those bodies were carried secretly at night through the town, so the town wouldn't even know that they were brought through. And that makes a lot of sense. There was great fear of cholera, and yes, towns would not have welcomed any indication of it. And but for the Catholic churches that often did try to serve these men and help take care of them, not much would have been done. The canal company did minimal, created what they called hospitals, but they were really just buildings for them to die in or get better in, one or the other. We have no idea how many men died on the canal. We know that many Irishmen disappeared into the United States at that time. In the early 19th century, it was well before the potato famine of the 1840s. In the early part, it was men coming here, boys, middle-aged men, older men, and they came here not for a good life in a new country. They came here to earn money so they could go back to Ireland and buy a little piece of land, because they were Celtic Catholic. And for 300 years, the English had tried to eradicate them and their culture.
Any more questions, Teresa?
I think that's about it.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you for your interest. I very much appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Dr. Gray, and thank you for joining us this evening for really a very enjoyable and informative presentation.
I hate
The
to
third
go quickly through so much, but
Well,
no, but it's food for thought, and I believe that what you've done is stimulate people's interest to now pursue additional information, which I believe for those of you who may be interested in more information, Shepherd University Library is a good source. The third program in the 2021 speaker series will occur on September 8th at 7 p.m. Dr. Diane Roman, graphic designer and print historian, will present The Ladies' Garland, the story of an 1820s Jefferson County women's magazine. I just find that absolutely fascinating. We await word from Shepherd University on the in-person availability of the Byrd Auditorium for the program. So stay tuned. When we know, we'll let any of you of interest know as well. Thanks again and enjoy the rest of the evening. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.